The sun dipped low over the rust-red mesas of Arizona territory, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the land. The dry wind carried the scent of dust and sagebrush, whispering through the canyon where a lone woman sat beside a flickering campfire. Her shawl, tattered and sun-bleached, wrapped around her thin shoulders as she stirred the last of her cornmeal into a small pot. Her name was Naya, an Apache widow who had once lived in a proud village by the river. But war, greed, and men with rifles had taken that away. Now she wandered with her little daughter, Tala, barely 5, both surviving on whatever kindness the barren land would offer. Tonight, kindness was running thin. The child whimpered softly, her lips cracked from thirst. Naya touched her cheek with trembling fingers, whispering words in Apache to soothe her, promises she no longer believed. Her eyes lifted to the horizon, where smoke curled faintly from a distant ranch. She hesitated. That ranch belonged to white men. To them, an Apache woman was worth less than a stray horse. But hunger has no pride. As the night deepened, she took her daughter's small hand and began the long walk toward the faint lights ahead. Each step was heavy with memories. Her husband's face, proud and laughing before the soldiers came. Her people's cries as their homes burned. The shame of begging for scraps among those who once feared her tribe. The ranch came into view, a lonely sprawl of weathered wood and fenced pastures under the starlit sky. Horses snorted from the corral, and the warm glow from a window spilled onto the dust. A sign nailed crooked above the gate read, "Red River Ranch, C. Dalton, owner." Inside, Colt Dalton, the owner, sat at a table with a bottle of whiskey and a silence that clung like a second skin. He was a man carved by war and land, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, with a quiet sorrow that never left him. He had buried more than friends. He had buried pieces of himself. The Civil War had taken the rest. When he heard the knock at the door, faint, hesitant, he almost ignored it. The desert didn't bring visitors after dark, but something in the sound, perhaps the trembling, made him rise. Outside, in the pale moonlight, stood Naya. Dust clung to her dress, and her face was lined not by years but by hunger. Behind her the child clutched her skirt, eyes wide and hollow. She lowered her head, her voice breaking though proud. "Please, hire me for one night," she said quietly. "My daughter is very hungry. I can work, clean, cook, anything." Colt's eyes softened despite himself. He saw the desperation, but also the fire, that quiet dignity that refused to die. He said nothing, just stepped aside, motioning her in. Naya entered slowly, unsure whether she'd been offered mercy or a mistake. The warmth of the hearth struck her like a memory, something almost too painful to feel. She guided Tala toward the fire, where the girl's tiny hands reached out in wonder. Colt poured water into a tin cup and handed it over. The girl drank greedily, then smiled, a fragile, fleeting thing that made the cowboy's chest ache in ways he didn't expect. Naya stood still, waiting for his judgment. He looked at her again, the shadows under her eyes, the torn hem of her dress, the faint scars on her wrists that told stories without words. There were many things he could have said, many assumptions he could have made. But instead, he simply nodded toward the old cot near the wall. "You can stay the night," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll talk about work." Naya bowed her head in gratitude, though she dared not meet his eyes. She guided her daughter to the cot and tucked her in with the gentleness of a mother who had learned to love through loss. Then she sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker against the log walls. Colt returned to his chair, the whiskey forgotten. Something about the sight, a mother and child asleep under his roof, stirred a feeling he hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had gnawed at him now felt quieter. Outside, the wind moaned through the canyon, carrying with it the ghosts of two pasts, one of an Apache widow and one of a broken cowboy. Both lost, both searching for something they didn't yet understand. As the fire burned low, Naya's eyes began to close. For the first time in months, she dreamed. Not of running, not of fear, but of a dawn where her daughter's laughter filled the air again. But dawn would bring its own reckoning. For not everyone in the Red River territory took kindly to Apache blood, especially when it found refuge under a cowboy's roof. And by sunrise, word of her presence would begin to spread. The sun rose slowly over the Red River Ranch, bleeding gold across the rugged land. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and saddle leather. For the first time in months, Naya awoke not under open sky but under a roof. The wooden beams above her were cracked and old, yet they felt safer than the endless expanse of desert she had known. Her daughter, Tala, still slept soundly beside her, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the quiet breath of peace. Naya sat for a long time, simply watching her. There was a softness to that moment, one she feared to touch, as though it might vanish if she acknowledged it too deeply. Outside, she could hear the faint sounds of men preparing for the day. Horses snorted, metal clanked, and boots scuffed across the dust. She rose silently, wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stepped into the morning light. Colt Dalton was already in the yard, his broad frame outlined against the rising sun. He worked with quiet efficiency, his movements steady and sure, like a man used to solitude. The land seemed to bend to him, as though it knew he had given it his years and his pain. Naya kept her distance, unsure of her place. She had come only to beg for one night, not to stay, not to belong. Yet the memory of her child eating a real meal, sleeping in warmth, made her heart ache with gratitude she could not voice. When Colt finally noticed her standing by the porch, he gave a simple nod, as though he had expected her. He pointed toward the kitchen, where unwashed dishes and cold ashes in the stove waited. It was his way of giving her purpose, and she understood. She worked without complaint, her hands moving with the quiet grace of habit. Years of tending, cleaning and surviving had taught her to find meaning in motion. As she worked, she noticed the house bore the marks of loneliness. A single man's neglect, dust had gathered thick in the corners, and the scent of old tobacco lingered in the air. By the time the sun climbed higher, she had swept the floor, scrubbed the stove, and set a small pot of beans to warm. The place looked less like a shelter and more like a home, though not hers. Tala woke to the smell of food and laughter outside. For the first time since her father's death, she dared to step out into daylight among strangers. The ranch hands paused their work, curious and cautious. They had heard stories, whispers of an Apache woman taken in by the boss. Some looked with pity, others with distrust. By noon, the whispers had turned into talk. Out here, in the wide emptiness of the frontier, gossip traveled faster than dust storms. Naya felt their eyes on her, sharp, measuring, unkind. She had known such looks all her life, the weight of them pressed on her shoulders as she worked, but she kept her gaze down, her silence unbroken. Colt said little to her that day. He was not a man of words, yet something in his steady glances told her she was not unwelcome. He had his own ghosts. She could see it in the way he avoided the bottle that morning, in the way he watched the horizon as if searching for someone long gone. When the day began to fade, he brought her a small bag of flour and dried meat, payment for her work. She tried to refuse, but he placed it firmly on the table, his gesture final. The evening sky bled red over the hills as Naya stood at the window, watching her daughter chase shadows in the yard. Tala laughed, a sound so pure it almost startled her mother. It had been so long since she had heard joy in her child's voice. But beyond the fence line, Naya noticed two riders watching from a distance. Their silhouettes were motionless, their horses restless. The sight sent a shiver through her bones. She recognized the pattern of their coats, the gleam of rifles. Local ranchers, men who despised her people. She said nothing, only closed the window and drew Tala close. That night, as the wind rose and the coyotes howled from the ridge, Colt Dalton sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He knew what those riders meant. Trouble was coming. He had seen it before. Men who thought the color of one's skin or the blood in one's veins determined worth. The land was changing, but not fast enough. In the small room, Naya whispered a prayer in her mother tongue, asking the spirits to protect her child. She did not know whether to stay or flee. Both roads led to danger, but at least here, for the first time in years, there was shelter. Outside, the wind carried voices from the distance, faint laughter, angry tones, promises of reckoning. The Red River Ranch, quiet under the moonlight, had become a crossroads between mercy and hatred, between survival and belonging. And by morning, the first test of their fragile peace would come riding hard down that dusty trail. The morning broke with a strange stillness across the Red River Ranch. The sky burned a pale blue, streaked with gold, and the wind had gone quiet, as if the desert itself held its breath. Naya rose before dawn, her senses sharpened by years of vigilance. She felt the weight of unseen eyes long before she saw them. From the edge of the ranch, faint dust trails rose, the sign of riders. Her heart tightened. In the wild country of Arizona, a woman like her had few allies and many enemies. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and moved quietly to the window, watching the horizon as the riders approached. By the time the sun crept over the hills, they were close enough to make out the glint of metal and the flash of pale hats. They were locals, men from the neighboring settlements, rough ranchers hardened by life and prejudice. Word of her presence had spread faster than she feared. Inside the ranch house, Colt Dalton stood silent, his jaw tight, his gaze steady on the approaching figures. He had known this would come. The frontier was a land of unforgiving hearts, a place where old hatreds ran deeper than rivers. The riders stopped by the fence, their laughter coarse, their eyes mean. Though they said nothing she could hear, Naya felt the venom in their gestures, the mockery in their stance. Her daughter, playing near the porch, shrank back in fear as one of them spat toward the ground. Colt's presence at the gate was enough to make them turn away, but the message was clear. They would not forget that an Apache woman was living under his roof. As the dust settled behind their horses, the silence they left was heavier than before. That evening, Naya worked quietly, pretending not to notice the tension that hung in the air. She cleaned, cooked, and tended the fire, while her daughter clung to her skirts, wide-eyed and fearful. The child understood more than her mother wished she did. Colt moved about the house, saying little, but his every movement carried purpose. He mended a broken fence post, sharpened his tools, and checked his rifle before hanging it by the door. It was not a threat, it was preparation. When night fell, the ranch seemed smaller, hemmed in by darkness and the weight of unspoken danger. The coyotes howled from the ridges, their cries echoing like old ghosts. In that flickering firelight, Naya's mind drifted back to the night her village burned, soldiers and settlers sweeping through with torches and hate. Her husband, brave and foolish, had stood his ground and paid with his life. She had fled with her daughter in her arms, running until the desert swallowed her footsteps. The memories haunted her still, the smoke, the screams, the bitter taste of ashes. Yet, in this place of strangers, she felt something she had not felt in years, the faint stirrings of safety. Colt, too, sat in the dim glow of the fire, lost in his own memories. He had once worn a soldier's coat, had once believed in the righteousness of conquest and order. But the war had stripped him of illusions. He had seen too much blood, too many graves dug in hard ground. Perhaps that was why he did not turn Naya away. Perhaps he saw, in her eyes, the same ghosts that haunted him. As the fire crackled, a sudden sound broke the stillness, the distant whinny of a horse, sharp and urgent. Naya stiffened, every instinct alert. Colt rose from his chair and moved toward the door, his steps soundless. Outside, under the pale wash of moonlight, shadows moved along the ridge. A flicker of light, the reflection of metal, then silence. He watched for a long moment before turning back inside. His face was unreadable, but his eyes told the truth. Trouble was closer now. Naya said nothing, though fear burned in her chest. She drew her daughter close, tucking the blanket around her, whispering soft words in her native tongue. The child soon drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware of the dangers circling beyond the walls. Colt remained by the window, a silent sentinel, his hand resting on the rifle's handle. The moon climbed higher, silvering the land, revealing every shape and shadow. In that cold light, Naya studied the man who had taken her in, his broad shoulders, the weariness in his stance, the way his eyes seemed to carry the burden of both protector and penitent. He was not like other men she had met. There was no hunger for cruelty in him, only a deep, quiet sorrow that mirrored her own. The wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of rain, rare and fleeting in this harsh land. It brushed through the broken window frame, cooling the air. Naya closed her eyes and let the sound of the wind fill her thoughts. The desert was a cruel place, but sometimes even cruelty had its moments of grace. That night, she dreamed again, of her husband's face smiling in the firelight, of laughter and drums, of a time when the world had not yet turned its back on her people. But as dawn approached, her dreams twisted. She saw riders in the storm, saw fire on the horizon, heard the cries of her child echoing through the darkness. When she woke, the sound of thunder rolled across the land. But it was not the storm, it was hooves. And this time, they were not stopping at the fence. The first light of dawn spread over the Red River Valley, soft and golden at first before the clouds turned the sky to a bruised gray. The storm that Naya had dreamed of was coming, not of rain, but of men. The sound of hooves rolled across the hills like distant thunder, echoing off the stone ridges. Dust rose in wide plumes from the east, and the low rumble grew nearer with every passing minute. From the kitchen window, Naya could see the riders cresting the ridge, half a dozen men, their coats snapping in the wind, their rifles gleaming under the morning sun. She froze. Her first instinct was to hide her daughter. She grabbed Tala, still half asleep, and tucked her behind the old wooden chest near the corner of the room. The child's small hands trembled as she clung to her mother's shawl. Outside, Colt Dalton stood on the porch, hat low over his eyes, his rifle in hand. He had known this moment would come. The night before, the signs had been clear. Men watching the ridge, waiting for darkness to pass. The men rode closer, and even from a distance, Naya could feel the bitterness that clung to them. The desert bred hard men, but hatred made them meaner. They came not for justice, but for pride, to remind the land that it still belonged to them, and to make an example of anyone who defied its cruel order. Inside, the house felt smaller than ever. The air was thick with fear. Naya's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She dared a glance through the crack in the wooden boards, watching as the men reined in their horses by the fence. Colt's posture never changed. He stood like a man who had already made peace with the fight ahead. The men dismounted, kicking up dust. Though their words carried faintly on the wind, their meaning was clear enough. They wanted the Apache woman gone, and they didn't intend to leave without making sure of it. The leader, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, spat into the dirt. His gesture was enough to ignite the tension that hung between them. The desert held its breath. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Naya's hand hovered near the old kitchen knife by the table, a small, useless thing against rifles and hate. But it was all she had. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but her daughter's trembling beneath the shawl anchored her in place. Running meant being hunted again. Staying meant trusting the cowboy who had given her shelter. The first shot shattered the silence. It struck the fence post, splintering wood into the air. The horses neighed and reared, and the men shouted, their voices sharp and cruel. Naya gasped, pressing her daughter's head against her chest as the echoes rang through the house. Colt did not retreat. He moved with calm precision, his rifle lifted, his stance steady. The next shot that rang out was his. And this time, one of the men fell from his horse. Chaos erupted. The desert roared with gunfire, dust, and the cries of startled animals. The echoes of the fight carried for miles. Inside, Naya huddled near the window, fear clawing through her chest. She wanted to run to him, to stop the violence, but her legs refused to move. All she could do was pray, not in English, not in words the white men would ever understand, but in the old language of her people. Outside, the fight raged on. Colt moved like a shadow among the rocks and fences, using every inch of the land to his advantage. Years of battle had taught him how to fight without waste, how to move with the earth rather than against it. But he was one man against many. Naya could see one of the riders flanking from the side, creeping toward the house with a pistol drawn. She bit down a cry and reached for the rifle Colt had left by the door. It was heavy, rough in her hands, but she remembered how her husband once held his. When the man reached the porch, she steadied her breath and fired. The sound was deafening in the small room, the recoil driving her backward. Smoke filled the air, and through it she saw the man collapse, his gun falling uselessly to the ground. For a moment, silence returned. the kind of silence that comes only when death has passed close enough to taste. Then, slowly, the thunder of hooves retreated. The men who remained turned and fled, carrying their wounded with them. Dust swallowed their figures until they vanished into the horizon. Naya lowered the rifle, her arms trembling. Her ears rang, her heart pounded, but her daughter was safe. When Colt finally stepped back into the house, his coat was torn, his hands bloodied, his eyes dark with exhaustion. He said nothing, but Naya could see in his face what words would not admit. They had survived, but not without cost. Outside, the morning sun burned higher, bright and pitiless. The land was quiet again, but the peace felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Colt walked to the window and looked toward the ridge where the riders had vanished. He knew they would return, and next time, they would not come alone. Naya, standing behind him, followed his gaze. For the first time, their fears were the same, and so was their fate. The wind began to rise again, carrying the faint scent of smoke and blood, and far beyond the valley, more riders were gathering. The storm had only just begun. The sun sank low over the Red River Ranch, painting the desert in hues of blood and gold. The land was still again, but it was not peace that lingered in the air. It was the silence that follows violence, heavy and uncertain. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and dust, mingled with the faint copper scent of blood. The ground near the fence bore the marks of the morning's battle, hoof prints, torn earth, and the dark stain of death. The bodies had been buried quickly, without words, beneath the hard soil that had swallowed countless men before. The vultures circled high, patient and unfeeling, waiting for whatever scraps of fate might remain. Inside the ranch house, Naya sat beside the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her shawl, once clean, was now streaked with dirt and smoke. Tala slept nearby, her small body curled under a rough wool blanket. Every so often, the child would stir, murmuring softly, her dreams no doubt haunted by the echoes of gunfire. Naya's eyes were fixed on the fire, though her mind wandered far beyond it. She thought of the path that had brought her here, the raids, the hunger, the endless search for safety. Each time she thought she had found it, the world had reminded her that safety was a gift her people were rarely allowed to keep. Yet here, in this lonely ranch with the silent cowboy, she had found something close to it. It frightened her almost as much as the violence did. Colt Dalton sat by the table, his rifle across his knees. He was a man who had seen too much war to mistake victory for survival. The attack that morning had not been the end. It had only been a beginning. He had recognized one of the men who rode against him, a former soldier, now turned ranch hand for the neighboring settler families. Those men had power, influence, and most of all, resentment. They would not let the matter rest. As the evening deepened, the sound of coyotes rose from the hills, their cries carrying through the night like a song of mourning. Naya lifted her gaze toward the window, watching the moonlight stretch across the desert floor. It was beautiful and cruel, that endless landscape, a place that could cradle life one moment and steal it the next. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached to tend the fire. She thought of her husband again, the brave Apache warrior who had fought for his land, his people, and his family. He had told her once that the desert tested the soul. It stripped away lies and left only truth behind. If that was so, then her truth was simple. She wanted her daughter to live no matter what it cost. Colt rose from his chair and stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars spread wide above him, glittering like cold fire. The desert whispered all around, the shifting of sand, the distant murmur of the river, the restless wind sighing through dry grass. It was the sound of a land that remembered everything. He looked toward the hills, where faint campfire lights flickered in the distance. He knew what they meant. The men who had fled were regrouping, gathering allies. It would not be long before they returned, stronger, more determined. Inside, Naya watched him from the doorway. She saw the weight in his shoulders, the quiet resolve of a man who carried too much guilt and too many memories. Though he said nothing, his actions spoke in the language of sacrifice. The night grew colder, and the fire burned lower. Colt came back inside, hanging his hat on the peg and setting his rifle near the door. He did not rest. He simply sat again, staring into the flames with that same stillness that seemed to hold the world at bay. For a long time neither of them moved. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the coyotes. Naya finally rose and covered Tala with an extra blanket. Then she turned toward the window again. The horizon glowed faintly under the moon, peaceful to the untrained eye, but to her it was a warning. The land never slept. Danger never truly left. In that quiet moment, Naya understood something she had not before. The fight for survival was no longer hers alone. The cowboy, too, was bound to it now, by choice, by conscience, or perhaps by something deeper neither of them could yet name. He had given her and her child a place of safety when the world had none to offer, and now she knew he would risk everything to defend it. But the cost of that choice was rising. The men who hated her would come again, and this time they would not only bring guns, they would bring the law. In the distance, faint and low, came the sound of a horn, not of cattle, but of riders mustering. It echoed faintly through the valley, a ghostly warning carried by the wind. Naya's heart turned to stone. She went to her daughter and knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. The innocence there tore at her, a reminder of what she stood to lose. The Apache widow looked toward the horizon one last time before closing the door. Outside, the land slept under the silver light of the moon, but beneath that calm surface, fate was moving, relentless, unseen. The next dawn would not bring peace, it would bring judgment. The morning came slowly, breaking over the jagged ridges like a blade of light. The Red River Valley lay still beneath it, a quiet before the storm, a silence that felt almost holy in its weight. The land had seen blood before, and it would see it again. It always did. Inside the ranch house, Naya stood by the window, her shawl pulled tight around her. Her daughter, Tala, still slept, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. The faintest smile crossed the child's face, the kind born of dreams untouched by fear. For Naya, that innocence was both her greatest comfort and her deepest ache. The Apache widow watched the horizon, where distant dust was rising once more. The riders were coming. This time, there would be no warning shots, no hesitation. The men who hated her had gathered others, ranchers, settlers, drifters, all hungry for vengeance, all certain they were in the right. The air itself felt tense, thick with the weight of what was to come. Colt Dalton moved through the ranch yard with deliberate calm, checking the horses, securing the gate, and laying out ammunition on the porch rail. He had done this before. The rhythm of preparation was familiar, a ritual born from too many wars. But this battle was different. He was not fighting for land or gold or pride. He was fighting for something fragile, a promise made silently to a woman and her child who had come to him in need. The sun climbed higher, throwing harsh light across the land. In the distance, the riders fanned out in a wide formation, their dust clouds merging into one. They looked like a storm bearing down on the ranch. Naya felt the pull of two worlds within her, the instinct to flee and the duty to stay. But there was nowhere left to run. The desert behind her had taken everything once before. This place, this ranch, was the last fragment of safety she could cling to. She turned toward her daughter and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Her heart whispered a prayer in her mother tongue, for courage, for mercy, for an end. By noon, the riders reached the far edge of the pasture. Their leader, the scarred man from before, raised his rifle high, his expression carved from hatred. His voice carried across the open land, sharp and venomous. The first shot cracked the silence, echoing across the canyon. Colt answered with his own, the bullet striking the dry earth near their feet, a warning. But warnings meant little to men blinded by anger. The battle began. The sound of gunfire shattered the calm, ricocheting between the cliffs and the ranch walls. Dust exploded in the air, mingling with smoke. Horses screamed and men shouted curses into the wind. Colt fought with grim precision, every movement measured, every shot deliberate. He had become one with the land, using rocks and fences as cover. The earth itself seemed to rise in his defense. Naya stayed near the doorway, clutching the rifle he had given her. Her hands trembled, but her aim was steady. Each time a rider came close, she fired, not in rage, but in desperation. Every shot was a plea to the heavens to spare her child. Tala hid beneath the bed, her small body shaking, her ears covered against the deafening noise. Through the cracks in the wood she saw shadows moving. Her mother, S, strong and unyielding, and the cowboys, fierce and unrelenting. The fight stretched on for what felt like eternity. Dust turned the sky a dull brown, and the sun hung like a cruel witness overhead. When the smoke began to thin, the ground was littered with the aftermath of hate, men fallen, horses fled, and silence creeping back like a tide. Colt stood bleeding from his shoulder, his breath heavy, his rifle empty. Around him, the last of the attackers retreated, their courage broken, their cause defeated. The leader, the scarred man, lay in the dirt, his fury extinguished at last. Naya rushed to Colt's side, her hands reaching instinctively to steady him. The blood on his shirt was dark, but his eyes were clear. He met her gaze. Two souls who had lost everything, now bound by the fight they had survived together. He sank to the porch, the weight of exhaustion pressing on him like the weight of all his years. Naya tore part of her shawl to bandage his wound, her fingers gentle, her movements trembling but sure. The silence that followed was vast, the kind that only comes after the storm has spent itself. The desert seemed to exhale, releasing its grip on the moment. Tala crept from the house, her wide eyes taking in the broken fence, the smoke, the stillness. When she saw her mother, she ran into her arms, burying her face against her. Naya held her tightly, feeling her heartbeat against her own. For the first time in years, the widow felt the burden of fear lift, even if only slightly. As the sun began to sink once more, painting the sky in crimson and gold, Colt sat quietly beside them. The horizon glowed, endless and empty, but not without hope. The land had taken much, but it had also given something rare, a second chance. In the fading light, Naya looked out across the valley. The Red River flowed faintly in the distance, glinting under the setting sun. Its waters carried dust and memory, washing away what the land could not forget. She knew they could not stay forever. The world would not forgive what had happened here. But for now, for one night more, they were safe. As darkness fell, the fire crackled to life once again inside the small ranch house. The mother, the child, and the cowboy sat in its warm glow, silent, each lost in thought. Outside, the desert wind carried away the scent of smoke and blood, leaving only the cool whisper of peace. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the spirits of those long gone, warriors, dreamers, wanderers, watched over them, whispering through the sage and stars. The Apache widow had found refuge, and the cowboy redemption. Two broken souls bound by fate beneath the endless western sky.